They called him too old for the front line. Then 121 Germans fell in just 14 days. January 18th, 1945. East Prussia. The temperature remained well below freezing throughout the day. Snow covered the ground in uneven layers, compacted by boots, tracked vehicles, and artillery fire. The remains of a small village stood along a narrow road. Roofless houses, broken fences, burned-out carts frozen where they had stopped weeks earlier. Smoke drifted low, unable to rise in the heavy winter air. The sound of artillery never fully stopped. It faded, returned, shifted direction, but it was always present. This sector lay on the outer edge of a major Soviet advance. The Red Army was moving west, pressing into German territory, but the pace was uneven. Some units advanced kilometers in a day. Others stalled completely, held in place by mines, machine gun nests, or sudden counterattacks. Losses were high. Commanders were forced to rely on whoever remained fit for duty. Senior Sergeant Ivan Petrov arrived at the battalion command post shortly before dusk. Petrov was 42 years old. He had been in uniform since before the war became a war of survival. He had served as a rifleman, later as a squad leader, and eventually as a senior non-commissioned officer responsible for training replacements at the front. His service record included defensive fighting during the first year of the invasion, winter operations near Moscow, and offensive actions after 1943. He carried an old leg wound from shell fragments and permanent damage to his hand from frostbite suffered during prolonged exposure in 1942. At the command post, a young lieutenant reviewed his papers. The officer was likely no older than 24. He spoke in a neutral tone, following orders passed down from higher headquarters. "Your assignment has been changed," he said. "You're no longer scheduled for frontline assault operations." Petrov listened without reaction. "You'll be attached to the supply and observation group behind the main line. Road monitoring. Reporting movement. No direct engagement unless necessary." The explanation was brief. No mention was made of Petrov's experience or past performance. The decision was administrative. Men of his age were considered less suitable for sustained frontline combat. The Army needed younger soldiers for assaults. Older veterans were increasingly pushed into secondary roles. Petrov acknowledged the order and left. By nightfall, he reached his new position near a damaged farmstead overlooking a frozen supply road. The building had lost most of its roof. Only one wall still stood intact. The ground inside was hard and uneven, covered with ice and debris. This location served as a temporary observation point. Its purpose was to watch for enemy patrols, track friendly convoys, and report any unusual movement toward the rear. Petrov's task was clear: remain hidden, observe the road, and send reports by runner or radio when required. Two younger soldiers were assigned nearby. Both were recent replacements. One had been at the front less than a month. Their job was to rotate watches, keep the radio operational, and maintain security around the position. They treated Petrov with quiet respect, aware of his age and rank, though they did not know his full history. Petrov checked the rifle issued to him, a standard infantry weapon, worn but functional. He inspected the ammunition carefully, counted each round, and arranged his equipment so it could be reached without unnecessary movement. He did not rush. He had learned long ago that speed without purpose led to mistakes. As darkness settled, the sounds of the battlefield changed. Artillery fire continued in the distance, but closer to the position there was only the wind, the occasional crack of ice shifting under weight, and the muffled movement of troops along the road. Vehicles passed at intervals, engines struggling in the cold. Petrov noted each one, its direction, and the time. This was not the work he had expected to be doing at this stage of the war. Only days earlier, he had been preparing to move forward with assault elements. Now he was watching from behind the line, assigned to a role intended to keep him out of the most dangerous fighting. He did not resent the order. He understood why it had been given. Commanders needed to preserve experienced men, or at least believe they did. But Petrov also understood something else. The front line was unstable. German forces in the area were still capable of infiltration and sudden counteraction. Rear positions were not safe. Observation posts often became the first point of contact when the situation changed. As the night progressed, Petrov noticed small details others ignored. Tracks crossing the road that did not match friendly movement. A distant light that appeared briefly and vanished. Sounds that did not belong to artillery or vehicles. He made mental notes, marking positions and directions. He did not report anything yet. There was not enough information. Petrov remained still, focused, alert. He had not been sent there to fight. But the war did not always respect assignments. And if the situation changed, as it often did, he intended to be ready. January 19th, 1945. The night ended without incident, but the morning brought no sense of relief. The cold intensified after dawn. Ice formed along the edges of weapons and equipment. Breath hung in the air and refused to disappear. The road below the observation post showed new tracks, boots, sled runners, light vehicles. Some were Soviet, some were not. Petrov noticed the difference immediately. German patrols moved differently. Their spacing was tighter. Their footprints showed hesitation near open ground. They favored tree lines and ruined walls, even when those offered little rail protection. These habits had not changed since the early years of the war. Men adapted to technology, but not to fear. The two younger soldiers rotated watch as ordered. One struggled to stay alert, stamping his feet quietly to keep circulation. The other scanned the road through binoculars too often, searching instead of observing. Petrov corrected neither directly. He watched how they worked, noting where they lacked confidence and where inexperience showed. Shortly before noon, a runner arrived from battalion headquarters. German activity had increased along the flank. Several supply wagons had failed to report in. Reconnaissance units were stretched thin. Observation posts were ordered to extend their watch outward where possible. It was a cautious way of saying that help would not arrive quickly if something went wrong. Petrov volunteered to move forward into the tree line beyond the road. The younger soldiers hesitated, unsure whether they were allowed to approve such a decision. Petrov settled it by preparing his gear and moving without waiting for permission. He advanced slowly, using terrain rather than cover. Frozen ditches, low rises, fallen beams from destroyed buildings. He avoided places that looked safe and chose positions that appeared inconvenient. The Germans, he knew, favored comfort when possible. From a shallow depression overlooking a narrow path, he waited. Hours passed. In the late afternoon, movement appeared. 3 German soldiers. Not a patrol in the formal sense. No clear formation, no urgency. Likely a reconnaissance element checking the rear before committing larger forces. They spoke quietly, careless in the belief that they were beyond the main fighting. Petrov observed them without lifting his rifle. He counted steps. He watched how they held their weapons. He noted which one spoke most often and which one looked around least. The youngest stayed in the middle. The oldest walked last. They passed without incident. Petrov did not follow. That evening, he returned to the observation post and reported increased enemy probing activity. The message was logged, acknowledged, and filed among dozens of similar reports from other sectors. Nothing changed immediately. During the night, German artillery struck a nearby crossroads. The bombardment was brief but precise. It suggested observation rather than chance. Someone had been watching. Petrov adjusted the watch schedule. He positioned one soldier closer to the radio and moved the other away from the road entirely. He explained his reasoning simply. They know where movement usually is, he said, so we won't be there. No one argued. Near midnight, Petrov left the post again. Alone this time, he returned to the tree line and moved deeper, following the path the German soldiers had taken earlier. He moved slowly enough that his body heat would not fog the air around him. He avoided branches and frozen brush. When he reached a small clearing, he stopped. Voices. Low. Controlled. German. 5 men this time. They were resting, unaware they had been tracked. Weapons leaned against a wall. One soldier smoked despite the cold. Petrov waited. He did not act quickly. He did not rush the moment. He watched for habits, for patterns, for the instant when movement would expose them without warning. When it came, it was brief. 2 shots. Controlled. Close. The rest scattered, panicked, firing blindly into darkness. They ran in different directions, abandoning equipment and wounded men behind. Petrov withdrew immediately, leaving confusion rather than pursuit. By morning, Soviet troops found the remains of the encounter. No bodies were counted officially. No report mentioned Petrov by name. But German movement along that path stopped entirely. Back at the observation post, the younger soldiers noticed the change. The road was quiet. Too quiet. Petrov said nothing. He cleaned his rifle, checked his ammunition, and returned to watching the road. The war had begun to move toward him again, and this time it would not stop at observation. January 22nd, 1945. By the 4th day, the front no longer felt distant. Artillery fire shifted closer, no longer rolling across the horizon, but landing with a sharper, heavier sound. The ground shook in short bursts. Snow fell from ruined walls and tree branches with every impact. Reports arrived irregularly, carried by runners who moved cautiously and spoke little. The observation post remained in place, but its role had changed. What had begun as rear area monitoring was now functioning as an early warning point for a sector that was quietly becoming exposed. Petrov understood this before it was formally acknowledged. German units had adjusted their movement patterns. They no longer probed openly. Instead, they tested gaps, moving at irregular hours, often just before dawn or shortly after sunset. Small groups advanced, retreated, then returned hours later from a different direction. It was a method Petrov had seen before, used when forces were limited but determined to delay an advance. He briefed the younger soldiers without raising his voice. He explained where not to look, which sounds to ignore, and which ones mattered. He reassigned their positions slightly, shifting them away from the obvious vantage points that inexperienced soldiers favored. Do not search for them, he told them. Let them come to places they think are empty. Late that afternoon, a platoon from a neighboring unit passed through the area. They were moving forward to reinforce a weakened line. Their officer paused at the observation post, studying the terrain with uncertainty. He was newly assigned and unfamiliar with the sector. Petrov pointed out likely German approach routes, tree lines that appeared harmless, depressions in the snow that offered covered movement, gaps between destroyed buildings that forced men to slow down. The officer listened, asked questions, and followed the advice. That platoon would pass through without loss that night. After sunset, the temperature dropped further. Weapons became difficult to operate without gloves, but gloves reduced dexterity. Petrov removed his when necessary and ignored the pain. He had learned how long his hands could endure before becoming useless. Shortly before midnight, movement appeared again near the road. A group larger than before. 8, possibly 10 men. They advanced carefully, spacing themselves more intelligently than earlier patrols. Petrov did not engage immediately. He waited for confirmation. He followed their movement parallel to the road, staying low, keeping distance. The Germans paused near a partially collapsed stone wall. They spoke briefly. One man moved forward alone, likely to scout the road. Petrov acted then. One shot. Clean. Immediate. The rest reacted instantly, diving for cover and returning fire toward where they believed the shot had come from. But Petrov had already moved. He changed position twice before they fired their third burst. He fired again, this time at a man attempting to rally the others. The group broke apart, retreating in disorder. 2 dragged a wounded comrade. 1 dropped his weapon entirely. Petrov withdrew without pursuit. By morning, the evidence remained. Blood in the snow. Abandoned equipment. A German helmet split cleanly along the rim. Word reached battalion headquarters. The sector was now considered active contact territory. Additional reconnaissance teams were assigned, but they operated cautiously, aware that something or someone was already shaping the ground. Petrov was reassigned again, not away from the front, but closer to it. He was attached to a small ad hoc group tasked with counter-reconnaissance. No official designation, no clear command structure, just men who understood the terrain and could move quietly through it. Over the next 3 days, the pattern repeated. German patrols entered the area and failed to return intact. Some vanished entirely. Others returned shaken, reporting fire from unseen positions. Their caution increased, slowing their advance and forcing them to commit more men to less effective probing. Petrov kept track, not with marks on a rifle or notes in a book, with memory. Each engagement was recorded in his head, along with what had worked and what had not. By the end of the week, German movement along the road had dropped sharply. Artillery fire became less accurate. Their confidence in the sector had eroded. Among the younger Soviet soldiers, Petrov's presence began to change behavior. Men moved more carefully. They listened longer. They waited instead of rushing. No one called him old anymore. They called him when they needed to understand what the enemy would do next. And each night, as the war pressed closer, Petrov prepared for the moment when observation would no longer be enough, and patience would have to turn into something final. January 27, 1945. The sector entered a brief lull, the kind that came not from peace, but from exhaustion. Artillery fire decreased, not because the enemy had withdrawn, but because ammunition was being conserved. Smoke still rose from the ruins, but less frequently. The battlefield felt tense, suspended, as if both sides were waiting for the other to make a mistake. Petrov's group was now operating almost entirely forward of the original observation line. Their task was no longer limited to watching and reporting. They were assigned to deny the enemy freedom of movement in the area between the main lines. This meant long periods of silence, careful positioning, and engagements decided in seconds. Petrov selected positions personally. He chose areas that forced the enemy to slow down, narrow passages between rubble, shallow ravines where sound carried poorly, frozen stream beds that appeared safe but offered no cover. He instructed the men to remain still even when visibility was good. Movement attracts attention, he said. Stillness survives. One evening, a young rifleman named Mikhail joined Petrov at a forward position. Mikhail had arrived at the front less than 2 weeks earlier. He spoke quietly, asked few questions, and followed instructions exactly. Petrov observed him closely, correcting small errors without criticism. He showed him how to rest his rifle without pressing into the snow, how to breathe slowly enough that vapor did not reveal position. They waited for hours. Just before dawn, German movement resumed. A larger force this time, more confident, likely reinforced after previous losses. They advanced in staggered groups, covering one another, probing for resistance. Petrov allowed them to enter fully. He did not rush the moment. He waited until their spacing broke, until attention focused forward rather than to the flanks. When the first shot came, it was deliberate and precise. The man at the center fell. Confusion followed immediately. Petrov directed fire with brief gestures. No shouting, no signals that carried sound. The engagement lasted less than a minute. When it ended, the Germans withdrew, leaving behind casualties and equipment. Mikhail remained motionless, following orders even as bullets passed close enough to crack frozen earth beside him. Afterward, he looked at Petrov, waiting. "You did well," Petrov said. Nothing more. By the end of that day, reports confirmed that German forces had reduced activity across the entire sector. Reconnaissance units avoided the area. Movement shifted east away from Petrov's positions. The front line adjusted accordingly. Petrov's group was credited informally with the change, though no written commendation followed. The army was advancing rapidly now. Units merged, separated, and moved again before paperwork could catch up. In the evenings, the younger soldiers gathered in ruined buildings, sharing rations and stories. They spoke of home, of families, of what they would do when the war ended. Petrov listened but rarely spoke. When he did, it was practical advice. How to keep weapons dry, how to sleep without fully relaxing, how to recognize when fear turned dangerous. One night, Mikhail asked him why he had not been promoted further. Petrov considered the question. "I did not seek it," he said. "I stayed where I was useful." The war did not reward usefulness with recognition. It rewarded survival and momentum. By now, Petrov had become a fixed point for the men around him. They adjusted their behavior based on his presence. They slowed down. They thought before acting. Losses decreased, but the pressure did not disappear. German units, frustrated by repeated failures, began preparing heavier responses. Artillery calibration improved. Mortar fire crept closer to known Soviet positions. Petrov recognized the signs. The lull was ending, and the next phase would not be quiet. February 2nd, 1945. The change came without warning. Not with an attack, but with orders. Before dawn, a liaison officer reached Petrov's position carrying a folded map and verbal instructions. German forces were pulling back from several nearby villages, consolidating along a new defensive line farther west. The Red Army was to advance immediately and secure the ground before it could be reorganized. Petrov's group was reassigned once more. This time, their task was to move ahead of the main elements and clear the approach routes. Not an assault unit, not reconnaissance in the formal sense. They were to identify resistance, disrupt enemy movement, and prevent ambushes as the infantry pushed forward. It was dangerous work, suited neither to the inexperienced nor to those inclined toward reckless speed. Petrov accepted the assignment without comment. They moved at first light. The snow had hardened overnight, making footsteps louder. Petrov adjusted the pace, forcing the men to move slower than they preferred. He stopped often, listening, studying the ground ahead. Several times he redirected the route entirely, avoiding roads and paths that appeared too obvious. German rearguard elements were still present. Small groups left behind to delay the advance, to force caution, to inflict losses before withdrawing again. These units fought differently than frontline troops. They relied on surprise and confusion rather than sustained fire. Petrov anticipated this. Near the edge of a ruined village, he halted the group. The buildings stood in uneven rows, many collapsed inward. Snow-filled windows and doorways created deep shadows. The place looked abandoned, but Petrov did not trust it. He sent 2 men wide, instructing them not to enter any structure. He and the others remained still, watching. Minutes passed, then movement. A German soldier appeared briefly at a second-story opening before pulling back. It was a mistake made from habit, not urgency. Petrov fired immediately. The shot echoed sharply in the enclosed space. Return fire followed at once. Machine guns opened from positions deeper in the village, cutting across the street where Soviet infantry would have advanced moments later. Petrov's group engaged without advancing. They fired selectively, forcing the Germans to reveal positions before withdrawing. The exchange lasted less than 10 minutes. When it ended, the Germans disengaged, retreating west under cover of smoke. The main Soviet force entered the village later that morning with minimal resistance. This pattern repeated throughout the day. At a frozen stream crossing, Petrov identified tripwires buried under snow. At a narrow road bend, he detected a machine gun position before it could fire. Each time, his group disrupted the defense just long enough for the larger unit to pass safely. Casualties were recorded. Numbers added quietly, without emphasis. Some confirmed, some assumed. The exact count mattered less than the result. By evening, the battalion commander reviewed reports and noticed something unusual. One sector showed consistent success with unusually low losses. The same name appeared repeatedly in after-action notes. Petrov was summoned. The commander studied him briefly, noting the age, the posture, the worn equipment. "You're still fit for this?" he asked. Petrov answered simply, "Yes." No further discussion followed. Petrov was instructed to remain forward as long as conditions allowed. By the end of the 14th day since his return to active engagement, the accumulated figures were undeniable. German casualties attributed to actions in Petrov's operating area reached 121. The number was recorded without decoration, filed among dozens of other statistics in an advancing army's paperwork. There was no announcement, no ceremony. The war did not pause for recognition. That night, Petrov sat alone inside a damaged building, cleaning his rifle by touch in the dark. His hands moved automatically, despite the cold and stiffness. Outside, the sound of the front had shifted again, moving farther west. He did not feel satisfaction, only fatigue. He had not proven anything, not to himself. He had only done what he had always done when the war demanded it. And now, as the front moved on once more, he knew the moment was coming when he would be sent back again, away from the noise, away from the danger, away from the part of the war that no longer wanted men like him. He finished cleaning the rifle and set it aside. For now, the work was done February 10th, 1945. The front had moved beyond the sector completely. What had once been a contested line was now quiet, occupied by supply units, engineers, and scattered rear area personnel. The sound of artillery came from far to the west, distant and irregular. Snow still covered the ground, but the tracks were different now. More wagons than troops, more construction than destruction. Petrov received his final reassignment without ceremony. He was ordered to remain behind with a support detachment tasked with guarding supply routes and coordinating movement through the clear villages. It was work that required experience, but little exposure to direct combat. For men like him, this was how the war usually ended, not with a final battle, but with gradual removal from danger. He accepted the order without protest. The younger soldiers he had worked with were transferred forward. Some shook his hand before leaving. Others nodded, unsure how to speak to someone who had quietly shaped their survival. Mikhail stood longest, adjusting his gear repeatedly before finally meeting Petrov's eyes. "I'll remember," he said. Petrov nodded once. As days passed, reports from the west spoke of continued fighting, of resistance hardening closer to Germany's interior. Names of places changed. Units changed. Losses continued. Petrov followed none of it closely. His responsibilities were local now: routes, schedules, security. The war no longer pressed against him directly. One evening, he walked alone through the village that had once marked the edge of the fighting. The buildings stood silent, their walls scarred by bullets and shell fragments. Snow filled the craters. The ground had already begun to hide what had happened there. Petrov stopped near the road where he had first been assigned weeks earlier. The position no longer served any tactical purpose. No one watched it now. He stood there for a moment, listening. There was no sense of triumph, no relief, only distance. He understood then that his part in the war would never be recorded in detail. His name would not appear in histories or on monuments. The numbers associated with his actions would remain lines in reports, separated from the man who produced them. That did not trouble him. Wars were not decided by recognition. They were decided by moments, by men placed in the right position at the right time, doing what needed to be done without expectation. Petrov returned to his duties. Spring would come eventually. The war would end soon after. He would return home older than the country he had left, carrying memories he would not share. History would remember the victories, the offensives, the flags raised over ruined cities. It would forget the veterans who were told they were finished and proved otherwise without ever needing to be seen. In the final accounting, Petrov did not stand out, and that perhaps was the truest mark of a soldier who understood the war completely.